Actually, the classes have started, online classes. That is why I
Yes,
think
ma'am.
many are not able to be in on
Yes,
time.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
But
Yes,
anyway,
ma'am.
we
Yes,
can't
ma'am.
wait.
Sure, ma'am. We will start, ma'am. Uh, Good afternoon, and all. It gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you all for this 1 month gender sensitization and a capacity building program on gender, society, economy, and polity, organized by Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, Center for Women's Studies, and the National Service Scheme of Cauvery College for Women and Regional Association for Women's Studies. I welcome you all. May I now request Professor N. Manimekalai, Director and Head, Dean, Faculty of Arts, Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, to introduce our today's resource person and welcome the gathering. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Neela. We have an eminent resource person today, and it is very rare to get her. But despite her schedule and other preoccupation, she could spare her time. So, at the outset, on behalf of all the participants, I thank Uma for joining us today. And she's going to talk an important topic which will definitely be interesting. And it is my duty to say a few words about our resource person today. And indeed, we are fortunate to have such a renowned scholar sharing her thoughts today. Uma Chakravarthy is a feminist historian and a filmmaker who taught at Miranda House at the University of Delhi from 1966 to 98. That's such a long stay in the teaching. And I wonder how, with this schedule of full-time teaching, she was able to do other activities associating herself with the women's movement and writing in different forms and published so many books. So it is really a astonishing fact, but still Uma could do that. And from beginning from 1980s, Uma wrote extensively on Indian history, indulging with issues relating to gender, caste, class, etc. And a leading scholar of women's and feminist history, writing in the subcontinent, she has been called the founding mother of the women's movement in India. And that is why I said we have the fortune of having such an eminent scholar here and an activist too. Apart from engaging with feminist issues, Uma has also worked as a democratic right activist, participating in several fact-finding committees, including the International Tribunal of Justice for Gujarat. She also writes in newspaper columns on contemporary issues concerning women and human rights. So writing, and making and the issues presenting in a perspective has been her contributions. She writes on Buddhism, early Indian history, the 19th century on contemporary issues, etc. And she authored several books. I just mentioned a few, which itself has been quite astonishing. Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism in 1987, Rewriting History, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai, one of the important piece she has produced, that 1998. Gendering Caste Through a Feminist Lens, 2002, and it was republished, reprinted several times. And this has been the major, and it is served as a list in the list of bibliography in women's studies. Almost all the contributions of Uma. And everyday lives, everyday histories beyond the kings and brahmanas of ancient India, 2006. She's also co-authored Daily Rights, 3 Days in the Life of a Nation, 1987. Shadow Lives, Writings on Widowhood, 2006. From Myths to Markets, Essays on Gender, 1999. Gendering Caste, through feminist lens, making a difference, memories from women's movement in India. And Lives, Writings on Widowhood, Faulty Lines of History, the Indian paper 2, Everyday Life, Everyday History. I'm out of time, I'm not getting the years here. From Myths to Market, Essays on Gender, Thinking Gender, Doing Gender. This is again a popular book which is being used for the women's studies. Women, Mobility and Incarnation, and Recasting of Self Across the Bangladesh-India border, etc., etc. There are several other contributions, and she keeps writing, and she keeps associating herself with movements, including the contemporary current issue, the movement with Seinbach also. Since 1970s, Uma Chakravarthy has been associated with the movement, and also with the issues related to human rights violations, communal rights, and state repression, the major areas. And she recently also reported on Kashmir, not recently, 2003. Her essay, A Kashmir Diary, 7 Days in an Armed Paradise, was published on the edited book by Urvashi Battalia, and that was titled as Speaking Speech, Women's Voices from Kashmir. And another component, and the other side of Uma Chakravarthy has been the filmmaker. She has also directed several documentary films. The major one would be the Quite Little Entry and Fragments of Past, both of which focus on, among other issues, women's history in India. So we had an opportunity to watch and comment on the films which were screened there in the recent IAWS conference and also earlier at Pune. And I think it has been done by various women's study centers. So this is the contribution and the kind of the influence that Uma has been making as a person, as an activist, as a teacher, as a historian, and as a researcher. And I admit that it is quite fortunate for us to have her here for this interaction. So welcome, Uma, for this interaction. I welcome you, and also welcome all the participants here who are ready, eager to wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you very much. After that long introduction, let's get down to the topic itself. So I'm both happy and delighted to be speaking to you, but I'm also, I feel the absence of seeing your faces, which is how I normally lecture, when you can actually see your audience. Unfortunately, this method, which is very good otherwise, it doesn't allow you to see your audience. So I feel a little, what would I call it, a little disoriented by that. But I hope that we will make up by having a good session as far as question and answers is concerned. Now, I chose this subject of the 19th century women's writing because this is a part of my work which I am very attached to, because I did a lot of reading and research at that time, and I think it was a very enjoyable time in my life when I read, and then wrote this book, in which I had to reconceptualize many things, because up until that time we were simply adding women to the subjects that we were dealing with. So it is, we call the add women and stir approach. You simply add women to whatever exists. But I felt the need for rewriting, actually reconceptualizing. So this book, which was in and around Ramabai, Pandita Ramabai, also led me to examine writings of women, particularly in Maharashtra, but also in Bengal, which both these regions had a long history of women entering the field of writing. Now, one of the things that you may all be familiar with is that the amount of writing that we would expect that women would have done historically did not, we don't have access to that writing, partly because formal writing was always kept away from women. Learning was confined basically to a small section of society, to basically upper caste men. So women and the lower orders were excluded from reading and writing. And there were many taboos. So, for instance, there are statements in the old text which says that if a Shudra hears the sacred text, then you should put molten lead into his ear. And women in particular were kept out by certain kinds of taboos. For instance, many women who did finally write in Maharashtra would describe the fact that they were terrified of crossing the boundary and reading even secretly, or learning to read even secretly, because it was believed that if you read, if you got literate and if you did reading and writing, you would become a widow. And you know that even today, but even especially in the 19th century, widowhood was one of the worst things that could happen to a woman. So using terror, they actually ensured that women did not cross the line and read. And so you might have, brothers and brothers learning in the same house as you, but you were not expected to, even if you heard it, you were not expected to access that learning. And this taboo was very powerful. So if you take a book like, you must all be familiar with the fact that there is this 2-volume collection called Women's Writing in India, which Susie Tharu and K. Lalita edited. If you look at it and you look at the 2 volumes, you'll find very little for ancient and medieval times. The number of entries dramatically grows after the 19th century, because 19th century is the point at which a transformation takes place. And as the women's question began to be debated in the 19th century, a major transformation happens. Let me spend 2 minutes talking about that. You're all familiar with the fact that we had a large number of reforms in the 19th century, starting with Sati, then the Widow Remarriage Act, then the Age of Consent Act, and so on. So there's a series of these legal measures that sought to transform the status of women. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that the entire debate that happened, it was about women, but no women spoke in that debate. You'll not find, it's Ram Mohan Roy, it's his opponents, it's Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, it's a lot of men who speak. And in the late 19th century, Malabari, a famous reformer, put out a questionnaire and asked people to respond to it. But it's interesting that while there were 300 men or so who responded, there was not a single woman. He didn't send out the questionnaire to women at all, because it was as if to say, women are not part of that debate. Women, because they didn't have reading and writing or skills. And so, in a sense, the 19th century is critical from our point of view, because if you look at it, we have oral narratives still then. We have oral, we don't know of texts that they wrote. And that's an interesting situation. So it is the 19th century, roughly 70s and 80s, that sees this major transformation in which women begin to access formal learning. Now, how does this happen? One of the things, if women had been kept out of learning by men, but then in the 19th century, roughly in the second half of the 19th century, as the middle class started to be constituted and men began to be educated, you reached a point of time when they began to feel that they were disadvantaged, because while they could read and write, they alone could do that, and their wives, on the other hand, were left outside the framework of the reading and writing processes. And so you'll find that many of the women who ultimately began to write, they describe how they were introduced to reading and writing, and it was always by some man in the house. Usually it was the husband, but sometimes it was fathers and occasionally brothers who taught the women how to access the written word, to read and to write. So, and how does this happen? Why does this happen? It is because as the bourgeois family, domestic family, begins to emerge in the second half of the 19th century, the men feel that they need to share their own, they create a kind of domesticity in which they want their wives to be able to share with them something called a companionate marriage. Now, this companionate marriage is where the husband, traditionally men used to go out to seek their entertainment. They had their male friends, sometimes they had even other institutions by which they could go and access and entertain themselves. But in the second half, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, the bourgeois domestic family began to be constructed as an ideal. And in that bourgeois domestic family, companionate marriage, that is, that husband and wife are companions to each other, is an idea that began to be promoted and circulated. Now, in order to do this, it would mean that what the men were doing by way of reading and accessing literature and so on, their women should also do, because otherwise, how would they actually have a discussion and a dialogue with each other? So you find that at this point of time, men encourage women to enter the field of reading and writing. But you'll also see from many of the autobiographies and so on that they finally did write, that this agenda was strongly endorsed for the wife of the new professional man. So, say for instance, Justice Rana De in Maharashtra, it's his wife who's introduced him to learning. And there's a very graphic account of the household in which Rana De and Ramabai Rana De live, in which there are 13 women of different ages. Many of them are widows. Now, learning, however, was to be restricted. Formal learning was given only to the wife, the young wife. As soon as she's married, she's actually introduced to reading and writing by the husband. He leads her into reading and writing. And it is a specialized function of the married couple that is being encouraged. Because none of the other women, there are out of these 11 women, the other 10 women are not introduced to learning. Rana De himself has a sister who was a widow. Very smart woman, extremely powerful woman. She probably knew certainly knew accounting. She was quite the boss of the house. But she is not introduced to formal learning. It's his young wife who is. And later on, English is also introduced into their lives. So you'll see that at this point of time, and what is the impetus for this new moment? Many of the men would complain that their wives were equivalent to stones. That how can I share a relationship with her? She's like a stone. And this is what Kashibai Kanatkar's husband, Govindrao Kanatkar, says about her. So in that sense, you see that it's a very, it's a moment in which the husbands are now seeking to have the reformed household emerge. And in order to do that, they need to introduce their wives to learning. And I'll give you the example. I'll read out a little bit to you, which will indicate how this agenda comes along. So there's this man, he writes in the newspapers, and he calls himself Anonymous Hindu Male. He says he's very desperate about the fact that he has no one to share his learning and his reading with. He says, where is the Hinduani, wise and pure, who can quote Shakuntala and the Merchant of Venice, play the sitar or the sarangi and sing divinely? Every educated Hindu would like to have such a Kumud. Kumud was the heroine of a novel called Saraswati Chandra, as his wife. Such a lovely maiden for his wife. But where are these phantoms of delight in Hindu society? They exist in the brains of those who have read Kalidas and Shakespeare, but otherwise we know them not. And this is the complaint of this man who's saying, our women, particularly our wives and companions, are being left behind, and we are seeking that kind of a companionate marriage. So it's a very interesting thing. So initially, women are kept outside of learning because the men decide that they don't want to share it. And then in the 19th century, when it becomes the new model, then they are wanting their wives to be introduced to it. And sometimes they use even violence to ensure that their wives are taught how to read and write. So there's this, let's say, moment in the late 19th century, from the 1870s onwards, when there is a certain transformation that is beginning to take place. I want to compare this with an example from, and this is where the husbands have led them into reading and writing. Now, in Bengal, on the other hand, we have an example from a slightly earlier time, a woman born in the 1830s, called Rashford Devi. Now, Rashford Devi was the daughter of a zamindar whose father had died, and who at the age of 8 was married off to another zamindar, and she was then went off to her husband's home. She didn't know how to read or write. She was a great believer in the Vaishnav tradition, and her personal god was someone called Madhav. So she's, even before she is married, she is already attached to the idea of this godhead. Now, anyway, she goes off, she gets married, and she goes off to her husband's house. Years later, she begins to learn, but learn secretly, because women are not being encouraged to read. And she comes from a zamindari household in which the husband is clearly not interested in being either a companionate husband, nor is he interested in her reading and writing. So she secretly learns how to read and write from the alphabet book of her children. As they learn to read and write, she learns how to read the alphabet. And then she began to write. And for a long time, writing was a secret venture. Okay. Now, I've given you these facts about how suddenly at this point of time, either opportunities are opening up, or the husbands are encouraging their wives to read. Now, what actually is aided? See, one of the things that people, especially the ones where the husbands introduced to reading, you to reading and writing, they actually encourage their wives to write particularly their autobiographies, in which they could talk about how wonderful it was to suddenly access reading, and how the husbands had, how they were beholden to their husbands. So in a sense, the new woman who started to be educated and learned how to write wrote initially to, in a sense, uphold the new patriarchies that the husbands were creating, in which the wives needed to be educated. So it was like a highly cultivated venture. And I'll spend a little time. That is Justice Ranade, whose wife, also, as I said, Ramabai Ranade, she describes in her account of an autobiography, which she actually doesn't. It's not her own autobiography. It's what she calls himself. That is her husband's story told by herself, in which she describes how it was the husband who decided what she should read. So even after she learned how to read and write, she didn't choose her own material. She was actually, she was trained to read and told to read only certain texts that he approved of. And that's an interesting element of how controlled the educational agenda is. So what I'm trying to say is that, in a sense, this new culture, reading culture, came at a certain time with a certain baggage with the men, in which the men play an important role. But it is also true that one of the things that happens is all of these changes are happening at a time when the printing press has come into existence already in the 18th century. And by the 19th century, early 19th and through the 20th century, print culture has emerged as an important element of public life. Okay. Now, this is important because once the women learn how to read and write, they also access the print culture. And some of them write, and they write what they want to, and I'll come back to that in a little while, apart from the controlled venture that the men are seeking the women to follow. And we have to see then how this print culture allows them to speak, what they write, how they express themselves, and what are the tensions that are generated, what are the tensions that are shown in how they proceed to translate their skills, their own newly acquired skills, into something which is almost like a weapon, like a arsenal, a weapon in their arsenal. And I will spend a little time in a bit to do that. I want to return to Bengal because Bengal had a slight earlier lead over Maharashtra in terms of time, just maybe 10, 15 years. And I want to go back to Rashford Devi, the daughter of the Zamindar that I mentioned to you. Now, one of the things that she did later on, having learned how to read and write, and once it became public that she knew how to read and write, she wrote her own autobiography. She's called, so autobiography is a genre that emerges at that time, and it allows women to tell their own stories. So this book called Amar Jeevan, that is my life, is, on the face of it, it's a very innocuous piece of writing. I mean, there's nothing over there that is necessarily controversial. This text has been introduced into women's studies and feminist analyses by Tanika Sarkar, who has written a very beautiful and moving and powerful introduction to that autobiography. And that introduction is so well done that you can actually see the dynamics of that, what she's written so marvelously. And I would urge you all to get hold of the book and read it, because it is a very powerful piece of writing. And autobiographies are like life stories, so they're in any case very interesting. Now, one of the things that she describes, and very, very powerfully, is how as an 8-year-old, she's married and she is being sent off to her husband's house. She has no father, you must remember. So the women are dispatching her, mother and aunts and everyone are dispatching her. And this little girl, 8-year-old Rashford Devi, is weeping. And this is what she writes. By then, I was petrified. My whole body was trembling uncontrollably. I was speechless. I forced myself to speak through my tears. Ma, will Daya Madhav, that is Madhav, her god, come with me? Mother said, of course he will. He will be with you. Do not cry. Nothing she said took away my dread, my tears. People had to make a great effort to snatch me away from her arms. I was seized with such violent grief at that moment. The memory still fills me with pain. Is it not a great tragedy that one has to go away to a foreign land? This is what she's calling it, a foreign land, leaving one's mother, one's near and dear, and dear ones behind, to go away to live under lifelong bondage. But such is the will of God. So let us praise the custom. So this is a paragraph from her, the autobiography that she writes later on. Now, it's an extraordinarily powerfully written account of this little girl who's forcibly sent off, in a sense, to this new home after she's married. And writing about it many years later, she's still able to so eloquently describe that moment. And you can feel the little girl's dread and then anxiety and fear as she leaves everything that is known to her to enter this world. Okay, anyway, then she goes on to writing her autobiography, and she talks about this and that, and she doesn't say anything radical ever, anywhere. Okay, But she passes in the form of writing that she adopts. She puts in little things, and they strike you. They strike you very powerfully. So one of the things that she describes, for instance, is that on one occasion she says that she never ate for 72 hours. That is 3 days. Not because she was fasting, but because she had no time. She had 17 pregnancies. So she had 17 children. She was in charge of the overall domestic sphere. She oversaw the cooking, and there were all these children. So she describes, just in passing, she didn't have time because sometimes the children were calling her, sometimes her duties called her, sometimes her husband called her, and so she never had time to sit down and eat. Now, she's not complaining. She simply writes this in her autobiography. And we are left now to read that and see what a description she is making. And one of the things that's striking is that even women from prosperous households, the amount of labor that is extracted from them as overseeing or even actually cooking was so huge that they really had very little time for themselves. So this description is graphic. She also says that when she occasionally was allowed to go and visit her, she was not allowed to go whenever she wanted to visit her mother. She would be allowed to go with a letter, a letter that she would carry with her. And that letter was called like a letter of contract. And it would say how many days she was allowed to stay in her husband's house. So it would be 15 days, 18 days or whatever. And she had to conform to the agreed upon terms. That is, she goes to her mother's house for those number of days. And that's a very interesting sidelight that she provides, because it's not something that she's, waxing eloquent about. She just mentioned in her writing. So the labor of women was required in the marital household in a way in which you could not actually easily go off to visit your own natal friends. And then she has a very graphic description of her mother who's dying, and she wants to go to see her, and she's not allowed to go. And then she's in terrible distress, and she writes saying that if I was a man, I would have gone. And her brother is able to go and visit her, but not Rashford Devi. And then she says, if I was a bird, I would have flown. But since she was neither, she doesn't see her mother. She has to let it pass. That is, the mother dies without seeing the daughter at that point of time. So and all of this, she's just fitted into her everyday. I mean, she's telling the story in an everyday way. She's not making a big drama of it. She's just describing it. And then there's some description that she has of people saying it's Kali Yuga. And then she turns around and says, they say it's Kali Yuga, but blessed Kali Yuga, where girls can go to school. So even though she never formally went to school, by the end of her life, she's describing how changed that moment is. And she sees Kali Yuga as not dystopic, not a reversal of the ideal, but actually in a very interesting way as enabling women in a certain way. So in this autobiography, and very rich, complex autobiography, what is interesting is that she is able to articulate all this. There are other autobiographies that were written, and these include Vinodini Dasi, who was an actress who came from a low social standing. She became a very famous actress in her time. She was, her performances used to be seen by the richest and the best, the elite of Calcutta. She made some money. She was obviously the common law mistress of some man who also, by whom she had a child, but she couldn't give the child the name of the father because that was not permitted. And towards the end of her life, and she also a very graphic description of her humble origins, the poverty that she and her mother and her grandmother all experience before she becomes this actress, and then she begins to make money, and then everybody's status improves. But one of the things that she, at the end of her life, she's a rich woman, she has a lot of money, and the elite of, the theatre-going elite of Calcutta comes to her and asks her for money to contribute to this theatre that they want to construct. She gives them a large sum of money, but she says she wants the theatre to be named after her, so she wants it to be called the Vinodini Theatre. They take the money, they promise to say they'll call it the Vinodini Theatre, but actually then they go off and it is named the Star Theatre. So she's, because they don't want this questionable character woman's name to be sullying the theatre, even though the men are coming and seeing those performances, but in a sense they're trying to middle classify it and drop the tainted quality that the name Vinodini will bring to her. So you can see that actually women use the words not to necessarily say if they're good wives, they say what their husbands want them to say. But if they are not, then they actually write really powerfully and really very, let's say, not only moving accounts, but they give us a window into how not only the gender question, but the social history of the 19th century comes up very well from the writing of these women. Let's go to Maharashtra now. So in Maharashtra, you have, I've already touched upon it a little bit. I described to you Ramabai Ranade and the manner in which she's introduced to learning as a young bride. She's only 11 and she's married to someone who's 32 years old because he is widowed. And but you can, when they remarry, if they don't remarry a widow, then they'll only get young girls as their brides. So this man who is like 20 years older than her is her husband, and he's celebrated in history for having started teaching her the alphabet at the age of 11 on the first night after they are married. This is treated as a great event, but whatever it is, let's the politics of that choice that he makes, because he is among the men who have promised to marry a widow, because the widow remarriage movement has taken off at that time, in which case he may have gotten an older girl to marry. But no, because it's still a taboo. There is a very what would you call it? It's a tense moment. And Ramabai Ranade, who writes this autobiography of herself, but it was actually the biography of her husband, she describes that as soon as he is widowed, his wife dies, he starts getting telegrams from both sides. The Orthodox people who said, don't you dare marry a widow. And there are the reformers who all turn around and say, you said you were going to marry a widow, so you must stand by your original commitment. Both sides start sending him telegrams. None of them consider that he could remain unmarried. And after all, they are enforcing that on the widows. When the widows have been widowed, they are subject to lifelong widowhood and enforced, what's called enforced celibacy, and they must remain widows. But the men, it is taken for granted that they will marry, they must marry, and the only choice is, will they marry a widow or will they marry what is called a young woman below the age of 11, because that's the rule. That women are married off very early. This the drama. So the description is very interesting. The description that the choice of remaining as a widower is not something that he is able to exercise for himself, nor is he able to So he succumbs to the pressure in the family. And then they go on to doing whatever they are. He ensures that he absolutely trains his wife to be what he wants her to be. And there's a lot of energy put into how it's all crafted, how she has absolutely no agency in what she herself might choose to do at any given point of time. So there's a very graphic description. And even this, you read between the lines, she's not actually writing this in any rebellious or analytical way. She's just describing it. But when we read it, we can see actually the dynamics and the politics of the household itself and the whole agenda of it. Similarly, you'll find, so there are these women who learn how to read and write. Now, in this whole arena, that is by the, let's say, 1880s, 1870s and 1880s, there is a fair amount of possibility of women writing. And among the most interesting pieces of writing that come out of Maharashtra are actually two accounts. Now, one of the things that I've been trying to tell you is that that initially, at least, the agenda of women's writing is very controlled. It's sought to be very controlled, but women do find ways of expressing themselves. But there are two pieces of writing that I would bring in here. One of them is a book that Pandita Ramabai wrote. She was a widow already herself. She was traveling, she traveled to both England and the US in connection with trying to raise money for a widow's home that she wanted to set up in India when she returned. And in order to do that, she wrote a book which is called The High Caste Hindu Widow. Now, that's a very interesting book because one of the things that she does is to use the model that the conventional Brahmanical lawgivers have used, where they divide a man's life into four parts. So the student, then the grahastha, then the vanaprastha, and then the sannyasa. That's supposed to be the four different stages of a man's life. She does the same thing with the woman. So she divides the life of the woman. She's explicitly calling it the high caste Hindu woman because she's only writing about the high caste Hindu woman, and she's leading up to this terrible enforced widowhood that is placed upon them. But in doing that, she actually describes the life of women in these four stages: the little girl child, then the wife, then the mother, and finally the widow. And and she divides it like that, and she writes very graphically about. And she uses whatever skills that she has accumulated in her. She has a very unusual life because she traveled along with her parents who were Harikatha teachers. So she has gone to a number of places, and she uses both her sociological, her skills in noticing what is happening in that society, along with whatever is available by way of let's say, academic or other kinds of resources. So I'll give you an example. For instance, she uses the data from the 1871 census, which is a pre-census. It was not actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think the censuses began in 1881. But or maybe it was the 81 census that she described. There is a reference to the fact that in Rajasthan, it is noted that in some village, that 300 children, girl children, were described as dying soon after they were born. And the explanation given in all of this is that the hyena came and took them away. Now, this is clearly fudging. This is obviously a fake reason being given by the informants. But Ramabai deconstructs this very effectively, and she said, it's a very strange hyena that it only picks up girl children. It doesn't pick up the boy children. So it's like she's actually making fun, poking holes at the theory that is being promoted at that point of time. And it reminds me of what we used to do when, like, much later, when the dowry killing started, dowry murder started. There was this thing that the stove used to burst. And interestingly, the number of people who were supposed to have died, young brides who were supposed to have died in a stove burst, was quite substantial. And one of the things that we began to say at that time is, there's a very strange stove that bursts only in the hands of the young daughter-in-law. It doesn't seem to have ever burst in the hands of the mother-in-law. So it's like, it's clearly a fake reason being given, but it's something that we all accept because it's okay. I mean, this is how you actually you gloss over the wrongs that exist in your time. So the writing itself is interesting because it's very insightful. It's sharp and very analytical. And obviously, it circulated a large number of copies and so on. So there's the high caste Hindu widow woman, which is one of her most famous pieces of writing. But she did other pieces of writing, which I will not spend too much time at this point of time. I want to move to Tarabai Shinde, who also wrote a book, a very angry text, which is called Stri Purush Tulna. Now, I'm bringing up these things because they are actually outside of the autobiographical genre. They are critiques or texts produced by women because they feel impelled to write. And because there is a print culture by that time, they are able to write and their texts then circulate. And that's, I think, a very important dynamic that's emerging in the second half of the 19th century. Tarabai Shinde was a Maratha woman. So she didn't experience the Brahmanical woman's oppressive framework. But she was intelligent and she was obviously someone who read a lot. And she wrote this book, and it's the only piece of writing that she did, which is called A Comparison Between Men and Women, Stri Purush Tulna. And she wrote it because there was a young Brahmin widow who was charged with killing her own infant child. As a widow, she was not expected to have a child at all. Clearly, she had had what would be regarded as an illicit child. And there was a hysterical response. There was a court case around it. And there was a hysterical response in the press in Western India, which extremely was completely vicious in the way in which they attacked this, how immoral this woman was, how she brought disgrace upon their communities and their society. And Tarabai Shinde is moved to write Stri Purush Tulna because she says, hey, stop a minute. You're attacking this woman, but there was a man involved. What about him? And nobody's going for saying anything about him. And then she writes this very, very angry text in which she completely deconstructs patriarchy. And patriarchy is understood in the 19th century by these women not as patriarchy, but as the double standard of sexual morality. One set of rules for the men, one set of rules for the women. So she writes this very, very angry piece of writing. I want to go back to a little bit to the 1840s itself, and I want to bring in Mukta Salve and Savitribai Phule. Now, this is there. It is significant, and everyone should know this, that the first school for girls is set up by Jyotiba Phule, and I believe that one of the finest pieces of writing that has come out of women's pen is this letter or a kind of short piece written by a 13-year-old girl called Mukta Salve, in which she describes the workings of Brahmanism in her in society. It's a very powerful piece of writing. It's a short piece. It does not even properly conclude itself, and it's the only piece of writing that we have. It features in the women writing that I made a reference to earlier. You can look it up. It's the whole article, which is 2-3 pages only, is a very powerful critique of the way in which patriarchy, a Brahmanical patriarchy, is working in that society, but also the way Brahmanism is working in that society. Now, at simultaneously, and she's so in a sense, she's the first piece of writing that we get, which is a consequence of learning the skill of reading and writing and publishing, because this piece was published in a journal. So it tells you something about the dynamic that I've been talking about. Now, so that. Then there's also, and this is the first school for girls that exists in India, that is created by Jyotiba Phule. Jyotiba Phule's wife, Savitribai Phule, who now is very important in a variety of ways, she's been rediscovered. She too wrote essays, she wrote poetry, she wrote letters, and that corpus is interesting. So these people bring in the caste question quite effectively into their writing, and that, which means that the women's writing inflected by caste is a feature that you get very early on in the writing that begins to emerge. So that's also an interesting dynamic that we should actually keep in mind. So we see these developments as all having their own impact. I perhaps should like to end with, I think I need to end this. I think I should end this with going back to Bengal, where Rokaya Sakhawat Hussain wrote a very interesting piece, which is called Ladyland, and it's also called Sultana's Dream. You might have seen it. It's probably been included in some of the women's studies courses. Rokaya Sakhawat belonged to a zamindar family. She was taught reading and writing by her brother, and she went on to writing very powerfully and a lot. Among the pieces of writing that she's done is something called Ghar. And it's a really very, what would you call it, very insightful piece of writing, because she talks about how women are essentially homeless. That is, they are homeless in their father's house and they are homeless in their husband's house, because they are basically in transit, they don't have a stable place of their own. And so this thing called Ghar is quite an interesting reflection of the way she conceptualizes the essential homelessness of women. But she's most famously known for this essay, a story, a fable called Sultana's Dream, which actually reverses the Zanana Mardana phenomenon, that is the world outside and the world inside. And she does a reversal. So you find that the men are in the Zanana and the women are in the Mardana. So the entire society is governed by a group of women. They are ruled over by a queen. And this queen is a very enlightened person. She's very scientifically oriented. There are aeroplanes, there are technological features in that fabled land. And the women are doing everything and the men are in the inner sphere. It's treated as a kind of, let's say, a fable, because it's described as she falls asleep and this is what she thinks. And then when she gets up with a jolt and she finds that the world is as it is, which is the women are inside and the men are outside. and the women are cloistered and kept firmly within the workings of patriarchy. But she reconceptualizes it as a space and a reversal, and that's extremely interesting. The manner in which she reframes those spaces. What's interesting about this is that Ruqayya Sakhawat did not publish this in Bengal. It was first published in Chennai, in Madras. So it was a safer place to go publish that rather than home, because at home there might be the politics of reaction that might come to this. And so even the publishing history becomes very interesting in what she does. But it's a very well-known piece of writing, and you should all be able to access it. And it's quite interesting and quite a lot of fun in which you see that. So to sum it up, let's say that even though the men intended learning to be something which was entirely from the point of view of creating the new bourgeois domestic household, the women actually do something else with it. They turn it into something which they introduce politics into it in a certain kind of way. And I think that's very interesting and that's very powerful. And what is significant, what is the takeaway that we get from this is that however much you try and control the agenda for women and their education and limit it to, sort of domesticate it, contain it, don't let it go into critical thinking, actually women can use the skills of reading and writing to make an analysis in which they are able to express their own economics, their own politics, and their own way of looking at society. And I think that's the broad takeaway from the 19th century emergence of women's writing as a genre, and what we can get from it, from an analysis of this writing. So I'll end on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Uma.
much,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Nila, please.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your excellent presentation about 19th century women's writings in Bengal and Maharashtra. Participants, do you have any queries?
Yeah, it was a very good intellectual treatment, Uma. History always is interesting. Yeah, it is always interesting. And but for your sharing, I don't think that the participants would have got into these details. And now it is really emanating this interest of the participants and including me to access to some of the books you have mentioned. And the way in which you have presented and also concluded the takeaways are really driving us to do something. And I'm also reminded of even this has been happening in the recent past also. I think you would have read about Salma Ruqayya Malik here in Tamil Nadu. Yeah. Same thing. Yeah, same thing. She also used to write in secret and she in pseudo names. She never revealed her identity for a long. But very strong and powerful writing, and that too from the minority community.
Yeah.
And so we used to have a discussion as to, and now she is out, and thanks to politically, she participated in politics also, and that has given a scope also to come out. And now she could reveal her identity, and she flies outside and also contribute. So this has been happening now also, but how these women, when the opportunity was given to read and write and learn in that context where we didn't have such a freedom that as we have now, so they used for reconceptualizing and reframing and also deconstructing the kind of patriarchal and the bourgeois thoughts. And I'm surprised that these men that companionate, you mentioned, no? So only wives can do that. What is this discrimination there? Other women are there, but this wife alone. So how patriarchy has been very, very narrow, and it was not. But despite these facts, women could flourish, and they could make a mark. And of course, you ended up with Savitri Phule also. How she, and that story, of course, is told, but not all the story in these detail. So that is why it is really learning for us also, and motivating for us. And is there any questions?
Yes, ma'am. There is one question in the chat box, ma'am. Shall I read the question, ma'am?
Yeah.
Hello.
Please.
Yes.
Hello. Hello, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. You are audible, ma'am. You are audible. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Shobha?
Hello. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah.
I am very thankful that I am able to talk to you, and it may be because of this.
Can you introduce? Please introduce, Shobha.
Ma'am, I am Anwara Begum Majumdar. I am a research scholar from the Department of Women's Studies, Guwahati University. So what I'm saying is that I'm very happy that because of pandemic, at least I am able to talk to you directly. However, I have followed you in your writing for a long time. Ma'am, I have one question for today's class. Like, do you find or have you seen any difference between the writing of women in the 19th century and the writing of women today?
Yeah, no, well, actually, the range of issues that people are now talking about is wider, but essentially, even at the end of the 19th century, you could see that women had begun to raise fundamental questions and begun to understand patriarchy and outline its features and so on. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think that was a beginning. All of that has led to further and further refinement, and there is an explosion of writing now, and in many directions, many forms. You can be discussing this in the form of literature, in novels, in people are doing it in the context of history, looking at the writings of people in the past. I mean, even the compiling of, say, for instance, women's writing in India goes back to 6th century BC. So you can see that the voice of women, which has not accepted the unequal conditions imposed on them, is a continuous one. The particular time in which they are expressing it will shape the manner in which they will raise that question. So today, obviously, in the 20th century, there might be a different way in which you raise it. Some of it remains standard. It's like things don't change. So, but yes, of course, the contemporary moment shapes the society in which we live, shapes our understanding and also our responses. So to that extent, I think there is, along the same track, there is more complexity, more diversity in what the themes that are picked up and written about and so on. But by and large, I think women are expressing themselves as they did at that time, depending upon the questions of that time.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Dr. Shobha Shinde from North Maharashtra University, Jalgaon.
Okay.
Madam, it was so delightful to listen to you, and I enjoy listening to you again and again. I've done a major project on the social reform movement in Maharashtra and feminist groups in it. So I agree with you that these social reformers began by educating their wives for a companionate marriage. But then these wives also stepped out, and Ramabai Ranade did a lot of work through Seva. Ramabai, you have mentioned, and Savitribai Phule was the first woman teacher of India. But Mahatma Phule started the women's, school in Pune. So this extended the boundary and carried forward. Second thing, we seem to ignore Anandibai Joshi, the first woman doctor of India. The kind of fight she had to face in hierarchy from her husband. And in spite of that, he educated her, he said, God. And then she met Pandita Ramabai. So, what do you think about this Anandibai Joshi?
No, I think Anandibai. The story of Anandibai Joshi, which unfortunately she didn't write herself, but there is someone called Catherine Doll who wrote about Anandibai Joshi quite powerfully, and they have used her letters extensively to write the thing. Now, in the book that I wrote, there is a segment on Anandibai Joshi based on her experiences of being, in a sense, bullied into schooling by her husband, who pushes her to go to the to become a doctor and so on. He's a very conflicted man, you know. I mean, he's in one sense a complete patriarch, and in another sense he seems to share some reformist agenda. But he was very bad-tempered, and he too, like the Ranade couple, he was a lot older than Anandibai Joshi. He was also, I think, something like 20 years or 18 or 20 years older than her. So it's interesting in her case. See, the experience of going abroad. She came off in her own time, and she and Ramabai, Pandita Ramabai, were sort of distantly related. They shared some kind of kinship relationship with each other. And Pandita Ramabai had traveled to the US to attend the graduation ceremony of the Dr. Anandibai Joshi. So, in fact, that's why she goes to America. And then from America, she traveled around and then finally returned to India. Now, Anandibai Joshi's account is, her life is interesting because formally she never crossed the boundary. She remained the good Brahmin woman. She defended child marriage publicly. Even though, if you looked at her own life, she herself had suffered the consequences of child marriage, in which she was married. Of course, she could have been, even as an older person, she could have been married to a man who was a typical patriarch of his own time. And he's an interesting man because he is a reformer, but he's also very patriarchal. Now, one of the interesting things is that while she defends child marriage and publicly she does not speak against Brahmanism or patriarchy, in her letters she actually acknowledges the great amount of violence that she suffers. So it's a very interesting. So if you read her letters, and I've used this part of it, which is like, see, she used to send back. Obviously, she was trying to share her life with him in some form. So she would, in her letters, one of the things that she did was to send back photographs of herself. And there are these very interesting photographs. I think visually it's very fantastic because there are two photographs of Anandibai. One of them is her in a studio in which she's not wearing the Maharashtrian sari. She's wearing the what is called the Hindustani Sari. That is the Seedha Palla, you know, they brought over the style in which Gujarati women or UP women wear their saris. She's wearing it like that. And that's a picture she sent back. I'm not sure she sent the second picture in which she's standing with two other women. So it's a very extraordinary moment if you look at it in terms of the history of women accessing medical skills. Because the other two women, there is a famous photograph in which Anandibai Joshi and a Turkish woman and a Japanese woman are all in their native costumes. They've gone to the studio and they've had themselves photographed. They were obviously classmates. So not only has Anandibai Joshi gone from here to study medicine, but from Turkey and from Japan also people have gone to study medicine. And they're obviously in the same class. And this photograph is actually very valuable evidence of, let's say, the cosmopolitanism in education and especially in medical education. So now, to return to that photograph in which she sends a photograph of herself in a studio wearing this Gujarati style sari. Her husband decides to take offense at that. So he writes her a mean letter, very policing letter. And he says, why is she wearing that sari? I mean, it's like, look at this, something like 10,000 miles away from where she is. He's still policing her activities. That is, why is she wearing that sari? Why is she not wearing the sari in the Maharashtrian style? So then she writes back and says, whatever, what reason has she get? And it's clear that the sari, the way she's wearing it, would have been easier from the point of view of feeling warm in a cold climate, and also being able to wear woolens and coats and stuff like that. But anyway, one of the things that she writes back, and it's like a little dig at him. She's saying, okay, I did that, but that too is a costume of our country. So what's he objecting to, at the end of the day? And how is he policing? I mean, it's like a critique of this man who's policing her from so many thousands of miles away. So that's one of the things. And then one of the other letters that she writes is she actually brings up the great amount of violence that she suffered as a young girl at 13, 14, when he would fling, she describes him as having flung chairs and tables at her, hit her, and so on. And then she writes saying, in our country, we cannot complain. The women cannot complain. You have to silently suffer what you're subjected to. So in a sense, even she, although she came down and she was regarded as a perfect Hindu wife later on, even she in her private letters actually did critique the patriarchy and the violence of patriarchy that she herself was subjected to. So I think Anandibai Joshi is a very interesting example of the tensions in even the educational agenda and tensions in domesticity in the late 19th century. I hope that's...
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Ma'am.
So, yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, ma'am, I wanted to ask...
Please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one question. As after independence, so we have witnessed, huge, like the feminist, huge growth in the feminist writing from Ritu Menon, Nivedita, Kamla Bhasin, right? But even in the 21st century, even in case of but we have seen a violence against women, violence as in, I mean, in case if the women, raise their voice against religious, caste-based atrocity in the country, not only against the women, they are subject to violence. So what I feel, even in the 21st century, so this result in a setback to the women movement in this country. So what do you see, ma'am? We have seen there are many cases. There are a lot of cases. We have recently in the last year, there was a case of Gauri Lankesh case because she raised her voice, she was murdered. So my question is, pertaining to basically the violence against women.
Yeah. I think that one of the almost like the continuing feature of women's lives is that they are subjected to violence. You can also see, for instance, now in this pandemic, one of the things that everybody's talking about is that the amount of violence against women, where they are locked up with their husbands are also locked up with them, the amount of violence has gone up.
Yes,
and so they've had to create helplines and so on for women to be able to reach them. So you can imagine that it's so taken for granted and so unchallenged in some ways that at the end of the day, and I suppose in that context you might see this film called Thappad, where there's and one of the things that everybody's colluding, her in-laws, her own, to start with, even her mother, but then finally, there are these cracks that come up in the way people handle it. And I think it's a very interesting account of how everybody is complicit in telling a woman, it's only one slap. It's only, what's it? It's not really, come on, go back, sort it out. This happens, aisa hota hai. So in a sense, the sanction for violence remains somewhat unchallenged, in the sense that because the relationship of the marriage is supposed to be so fun, so important that within that you have to be able to tolerate everything. So yes, I think that there is a lot of that, and we can also see that violence against women is all over. The Gauri Lankesh is very significant. If you are a woman who speaks up, you get attacked in a certain kind of way. Now, it's not only that Gauri Lankesh got killed, because the right-wing forces have also killed Dabholkar and Kalburgi and so on. But there is a kind of way in which you do it to a woman, which is like, say, how dare you, shut up and stay within your boundaries. The challenge that women pose when they speak up is greater than the thing. I would see it, like for instance now, after the CAA, so many women came out and protested. It's an extraordinary situation because now you're putting women into jail for protesting the CAM. So it's like you can't take, if a woman's, she needs to do a sanitized, staying within the home kind of, even if she's emancipated, she does good for the family and she comes back, she brings in a double income, she does all of those things. But if she actually shows agency and shows spirit and shows refusal to comply by the patriarchies that are forced upon people, then she's regarded as both public and private. Then she's regarded as someone who must be punished in a certain kind of way. And I think that's really vicious. It's extremely vicious in the way in which it is being demonstrated. So you're right. I mean, it's not gone away. And the violence against women is a daily feature of our lives. And the challenge against it has to be sustained. It's a long struggle. It's going to be a long struggle.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Neela, is there any other questions there on the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. Shall I read the question, ma'am?
Yeah, please.
Ma'am, this is a question by Ahamoni. What do you think we can do today with inspiration like this, with the kind of media available to us?
Well, I think one of the things that we are, in sessions like this or in writing, people are writing in a variety of ways. They're writing essays, they're writing in the newspaper, they're writing letters to the editor, they're writing even in the social media, debates are coming up and so on. So I think that the forums have opened up, but and things have shifted. So it's not as if say it's exactly. I think let's say we've expanded the area of acceptance of our position much more than before. So to that extent, the long struggle for so many years, for 30 years, before we could actually put patriarchy on the map, has led to at least an acknowledgement that patriarchy is a very significant institution in our society, and that it actually works in so many complex ways in the lives of women. That itself is a huge understanding that we have furthered. So to that, I mean, we just have to keep on at it. Use every forum, possible to raise these issues, so that we do create more sensitivity to the rights of women to be full autonomous human beings, rather than be subsumed under the institutions that they have been slotted into.
Neela, there is one more question.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Other question, ma'am.
Yeah.
Medias are now not followed truth. What is your view, ma'am? This is the question by Bharathidasan sir. Medias are now not follow the truth. What is your view, ma'am?
See, the media is actually under enormous pressure currently.
Yes,
And
yes.
it has become terribly right-wing in every sphere. So whether it's in caste, whether it's questions of gender, whether it's questions of class, whether it's questions of state and states functioning, media is among the first to actually fall in line with the establishment, the established power structures. And so it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. One of the things that I've been noticing and complaining about is that you don't see too many women writing those middles and edit page articles and so on, even in places like Hindu and Indian Express, which are not regarded as completely towing the line. Hindu, you're all familiar with him, but there used to be Kalpana Sharma used to regularly write on issues of gender. Kalpana Sharma is no longer writing. I don't know where she is. So whether they have not replaced her. Suppose she decided to go off on her own, they should actually have someone who's a gender, someone who writes gender issues. So I think the space for holding dissenting opinions in this new right-wing moment has shrunk dramatically, because you aren't able to, and the social media is both a space that's available, but it's also a space in which you can be viciously trolled. So we know of people, like women from the minority community who have written very powerfully, Rana, Ayub, and so on, how badly they've been trolled, So it's the social media is both a space which is available, but it's also fraught, because it allows for this kind of viciousness to be expressed. It would require a person with a great amount of strength to be able to stand in that space and hold on to ourselves without collapsing in the kind of viciousness that we see around. I mean, I was struck by the fact that Safura, the woman, the girl who was from Jamia, who was put in jail and who was denied bail once, twice, and then finally, and she was pregnant. The viciousness with which people were trolling her was, I mean, I was just amazed, and I thought to myself, if I was that young woman, Safura, how would I have taken that kind of reaction in the public sphere? So even as these are new women, they're standing up, they're very powerful. I believe that, I think this is a fantastic moment, because these women have taken women's participation in politics to a new level. See, we've always been saying that women should participate in politics, but we've confined it to Panchayati Raj. Even 33% reservation has not come. Huh? So, but there are these young women who have actually come out, and they've come out from supposedly the triple talaq, from the minority community, which has been stereotyped as a society where women are oppressed by the men under triple talaq. But the fact that women from the minority community have other issues that they want to also deal with, and that they have participated as or the Pinjra Tod girls. These are girls who have actually, these are young women who have translated their understanding of women and politics into a completely different sphere and in a different way. And that's quite extraordinary. So it's not that I'm going to just stand as Panchayati Raj person, which is what you've given me, that dabba, that box, but that I'm actually claiming the right to protest as a citizen of the country. That, I think, is a very powerful moment. So even as there is an attempt to squash people, there is a way that these young women have. I mean, you look at Pinjra Tod. Pinjra Tod was a group that started off with talking about hostel rules. And today they are in jail for supposedly their support for the Citizens Amendment Bill. And supposedly some case has been foisted on them. So what they're telling us, what we are seeing, even as I'm saying that, it's a hostile right-wing press, it's a hostile society and all of it, yet you are actually seeing that women are coming out and expressing themselves. And I think that's the takeaway that we should have. For the so many years of struggle that we put in, this is a space that has been created, and that's important.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah,
Manimehalai,
I
ma'am.
think, yeah, we can wind up, I believe, if there are no
Yes, ma'am.
questions.
Yes, ma'am.
And also, Uma,
Thank you, ma'am.
I also have another session at 4 o'clock where Ishita is
Sure.
speaking.
Absolutely.
Okay, so wonderful session we had, and Neela, please,
Yes, ma'am.
for the formal.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon to all. I am Dr. Neela, Associate Professor of Business Administration, Cauvery College for Women, here to propose today's vote of thanks. I wish to express my sincere thanks to our today's eminent resource person, Prof. Uma Chakravarthy, feminist scholar, historian, and documentary filmmaker, formerly with Miranda House, University College for Women, Delhi University, Delhi, for her knowledge sharing session. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your valuable presence and gracing this occasion. You are the inspiration for many research scholars and academicians. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The pleasure is
bye, everybody.
Bye, ma'am. Bye, ma'am.
Bye.
The pleasure is mine in thanking our dynamic madam principal, Dr. Mrs. V. Sujata, for her effective guidance to conduct the program successfully. I take this opportunity to thank Professor N. Manimehalai, Dean, Faculty of Art, Director and Head, Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, Dr. N. Murugeshwari, Professor, Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, Dr. S. Shubha, Assistant Professor, Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, for their continuous support and encouragement. Last but not the least, I register my sincere thanks to all the active participants. Thank you all. Meet you all tomorrow.